Today's topic is about critical thinking, and we're going to explore the angle of technology, how that plays into critical thinking in a modern world. And, I often talk about, in comparison, wisdom that comes from the Greco-Roman period, the ancient period of the Stoics. That's one of my favorites. And I'm always fascinated how their wisdom applies 2,000 years later. Well, today we're talking about things like Google and computer algorithms. Well, they didn't have those 2,000 years ago. So some of this is going to be a new area to explore. And I'm going to share my screen with you so you can follow along with the slides. Today's research included The Guardian magazine, Psychology Today, and also the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So we've got a lot of great material for you to cover today. So we're going to start here with Google. And the first article on our reading list talked about very boldly how we might be making a mistake by outsourcing our critical thinking skills to computer algorithms. Of course, at Google, they are using those algorithms to find things that we want to find, supposedly based on our past searches and keywords. But also there's the dark side of it, which is that Google's algorithm is a trade secret and they don't open that to the public. They never publish it. They may just refer to it indirectly. So now, what do we really have here? We have something that has pros and cons, like a lot of other things in life. But if we step back critically, one thing that I noticed is that the fine print of a employment contract, or when we're subscribing to some service online, those fine prints go on for pages and pages, and we usually don't read those things anymore. We kind of skip over it. So should we be therefore critical about Google's algorithm? I think that we should, because even though we don't read that fine print anymore, Google's algorithm is quite important. And we have to talk about Facebook. They have algorithms just like Google. And Facebook, of course, is slightly in a different area because they are a social media platform. They are hoping to get people to recognize misinformation on the internet. And there's a new term that they're using called media literacy, where people and algorithms can recognize what is on the internet in terms of being faulty, or maybe it's true. They're trying to build algorithms that are smarter, of course, to decide what content is good or bad. But they're actually hoping that people can start relying on them and their algorithm to decide what content is correct or incorrect. So that would be a way of outsourcing our critical thinking skills to a Facebook algorithm. That's the danger area. Now here's another issue. For the third bullet on the screen here, I was thinking about, what if I post something on the internet and Steve sees it, and he doesn't know if I verified this information or not? So does Steve go through his own verification process to determine if a story or a news item is worthy? Maybe he accepts it easily because I've sent him good information in the past, or maybe he's got his critical thinking skills ready to go for any post, whether it's from me or a stranger. And there's another category, is the intent of news sites. We have to remember that news sites are, unfortunately, thriving upon when a news item is clicked a lot. That makes ad revenue for them. So we have to remember that a lot of the information on news sites is designed to be clicked. So after seeing all these different ways, these different inputs, algorithms, friends, news sources, maybe the ultimate answer is that we do need to strengthen our minds. And actually, that's interesting because it's the same conclusion from the philosophers 2,000 years ago. So maybe we will end up leaning on their ideas after all. All right, so now for different thinking errors, There were some in the article, and I've actually picked these three because I refer to them often as the three C's. And they're very specific ideas that we can incorporate into our critical thinking skills. The first is cherry picking. We've all heard this term before, but this is when someone picks ideas in order to support an argument, but they're far, the few ideas are just far from a fair or scientific sampling. So they're just including a few items there. And it's not enough to make an argument, really. Cognitive bias is another one. And that's when people are picking things based on their own point of view. They're not considering anything else. They're not being open-minded. And then there's consensus quoting. This is something that is something I usually chuckle about when I see this happening. This is when a person or an organization quotes what the view of the public is. Maybe they say it's in the form of a survey, or maybe they're just making up stuff. This is one of my favorites from the old days. We all remember this type of ad, that more doctors smoke Camel cigarettes. All right, so now for the second page of thinking errors. These are some of the ways that people make logical missteps in their mind. Anecdotes, we've all heard some of these, where people pick a few conditions or events that they've experienced, and then they make a big conclusion out of it, even though it's just a very small sample. Today on TikTok, a lot of young people are being influenced by people who are influencers, who sometimes make up rules like the top 5 rules for this, or 10 ways that you can improve your life. And sometimes it sounds like they've done a lot of research, but you really can't tell. It could be based on just their personal experiences. This is an example of one of these TikTok videos. They always feature keywords like secrets. They have a lot of pictures. They have a provocative image. And that's how that goes. Then there's also, for other logical missteps, you can have circular reasoning. This is when someone reaches a conclusion based upon no evidence. They're just kind of like concluding that after the argument, the conclusion must be obvious. And we don't hear this much anymore because it really stands out and is obvious. And then finally, there's overgeneralization. This is when one person claims that maybe X is true because Y is also true, but X and Y are not really related. And so there's no evidence to support the first argument. Okay, now we get to strategies of how we can improve our critical thinking skills. Because again, I didn't want to just talk about some neat ideas today for critical thinking. I wanted to show us how we could actually put this into practice. The first is realizing that your focus is very important. And you can improve that by reducing the distractions that you have in your life. This is something that even though they didn't have notification on their phones 2,000 years ago, people, the philosophers of the time, some of my favorites like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, they talked about how misinformation can be spread by word of mouth. Anyone can get inside your head. And so you have to keep focus on what's important to you, and then validate what you need to validate in order to show that it's true. Then there's looking for evidence. Today, when we notice an argument does not include any evidence or maybe lacks evidence, then we have to realize that that could be a poorly supported argument. And finally, what's omitted? Sometimes arguments are missing information. They just gloss right over it, and they go for more of a feel-good argument, like the sample that you see on the screen now. This old phrase from Coca-Cola, the company, says, "Catch the wave." They are trying to entice you with that. All right, now we move to how to model good behavior and critical thinking on the internet. Well, one great way to do it is like what we're doing right now. We're sharing ideas and information on how to improve that. We also, if I were doing, let's say, a class in Google searches right now, I would be not just typing some searches to show the results, but I would be talking aloud, to tell people what I'm thinking as I'm doing these searches, like, oh, maybe I typed too little, too much. And then, of course, you would better understand what I'm going through in making those searches better. Also, here are 3 tips. These last 3 bullets are things that I often recommend to people in order to improve their Google searches. The first is using the asterisk for wildcards. For example, one of my philosophical examples is in the early days of learning about Wittgenstein, I often forgot the name of his famous work called Tractatus. And if I had forgotten it, I could type a Google search like this, Wittgenstein asterisk TUS, because I know a piece of the name, and then it would find the actual listings for Tractatus instead of just all Wittgenstein listings. And then, of course, the next item is using quote marks to keep words together. If you're searching for a famous quote that uses ordinary words, put them in quotes, and it will be more likely to find the author of the quote that you're thinking of. Could be Aristotle, could be a contemporary. All those quotes, the internet is full of them. And if we use quote marks, it helps a lot. And finally, the one that is most surprising to people is how you can omit listings. For example, if I were to type just Mustangs, I would get lots of pictures of cars, the famous car. But if I type minus cars with a hyphen there, then I'll just get pictures of horses. So that's something for you to take forward. All right, now before we wrap up, I had to cover a couple of people in history because we've been covering the historical angles on critical thinking. And the first one I want to cover, of course, is Plato with the allegory of the cave. In that allegory or metaphor, we are told about the shadows on the cave walls and what they represent in reality. They're not the actual things in reality, but they're just representations or forms of the things in reality. And so this is also an important concept for today, because when we're doing critical thinking, we need to look beyond those shadows and try to find the truth underneath some internet postings. We also need to remember that, like these shadows on the cave wall, some information on the internet today is fleeting and temporary. And so impermanence becomes another element that we need to consider. And Francis Bacon. I wanted to cover this important thinker. He's from the 1500s and 1600s, and his little book, published in 1605, was called The Advancement of Learning. In that book, he is giving us some of the early tools for critical thinking, and some scholars think that this book could be the first or earliest text on critical thinking. Now, even I, in talking about critical thinking today, I realized I need to practice it myself. So when I was reading about Francis Bacon and his contributions in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I realized I need to verify this, because although this encyclopedia has been very reliable for me, I still looked it up, and there's a copy of this Francis Bacon book on the Gutenberg site. They transcribed a copy of it, published in 1893. That's a few hundred years later from the first edition. But I did search for quotes on critical thinking and empirical thinking, and I did find an interesting quote. It's not on the screen, but I'll read it briefly. It says, Francis Bacon says, "It is well observed by Cicero, men in exercising their faculties, if they be not well advised, do exercise their faults and get ill habits as well as good." In other words, you need to exercise your thinking, realize what parts of your thinking are bad or good, and kind of, going through that testing process. So we're, again, in a stage of not just empirical thinking or critical thinking, but self-examination. And finally, I've got the conclusion here. These are the major things we covered today: the Google and the Facebook, the thinking errors and strategies for improving ourselves, modeling good behavior, and finally, Plato and Bacon in history. I hope you can use some of these ideas to improve your critical thinking. But in addition, I do want to recommend that instead of just considering these, to really put them into practice, you might use what some of my friends like, which is journaling. at the end of the day, some people like journaling for just 5 minutes. And we talk about this a lot at Orlando Stoics on Friday nights. You might think at the end of the day, gee, today I learned about circular thinking, or Dan told me to use quote marks in my Google searches. These types of things, if you write about it, you're more intentional about it, then I think it can help you think more clearly in the coming days, and it'll therefore leave more room for critical thinking.
Thanks for watching this video. Subscribe to this channel to hear about new videos. Follow us on social media for more info. Visit StoicDan.com.